Now we have Thomas Keaton on environmental charging of lunar Regolith. And he's ready to go.
Could you just click on the slide a couple times? Thanks. Hello, everyone. I look forward to discussing some of the fundamental lunar dust research that the Materials Physics Group has been doing these past few months. Next slide, please. Everyone thus far has explained very well why dust is an issue, but I would like to emphasize the importance of specifically electron yields towards lunar exploration and commercialization. Since electron yields are the primary descriptors for charging properties of materials from the space environment, this data allows us to understand how stuff like lunar dust charges. Subsequently, due to the ubiquity of the charged dust, this information has myriad applications for lunar activities, and more specifically allows us to derive new mitigation techniques and engineer robust lunar assemblies more efficiently. It is therefore critical that researchers and modelers and engineers have a full understanding of how lunar regolith accumulates and dissipates charge due to environmental causes. Next. I'd like to review what electron yields are. Lunar dust is primarily made of silica, alumina, and various other highly insulative compounds. This animation is to help visualize what a single yield measurement looks like for an insulator. An electron beam will fire incident electrons that will typically cause the insulator to emit multiple secondary and backscattered electrons. Then electrons from ground will backflow into a grounded electrode, causing a displacement current, which can be measured. Once the sample surface becomes charged, this can affect any subsequent yields and therefore the measurement results. As can be seen in this animation, every time an insulator is exposed to a beam of electrons, the charge of the material changes, and therefore so does the measured electron yield. And this is why measuring yields of insulators is so difficult. Next. However, that animation was a single case that only describes a portion of the total yield curves that describe the charging properties of a given material. Insulators, and more specifically granular insulators like lunar dust, are by far the most difficult materials to conduct these measurements on because they are subject to charging and surface roughness effects within the experiment. This slide displays definitions of the fundamental parts of an electron yield curve and why charging occurs in each of the respective yellow and blue regions. Yield is defined as unitless ratio of electrons out over electrons in. And this is what the y-axis of yield curve shows. The x-axis is simply the energy of the incident electrons that contact the sample. E1 and E2 are defined as the first and second crossovers, where the yield equals 1. This means that the number of incident electrons and emitted electrons are equal and no further charging occurs. When a sample charges, the yield data point also approaches the charging limit of 1, but the physical process behind that result is different from the crossovers. If the electron yield is greater than 1, as indicated by the yellow region, it indicates the sample is positively charging. And if the yield is less than 1, it indicates that the sample is negatively charging, as indicated by the blue regions. And charging can occur due to a couple of reasons, depending on the incident energy and material. In negative sample charging regions, the sample charges because negative charging suppresses the total yield due to repulsion of incident electrons from the sample's negative surface, as shown in the figure on the left. In the positive charging region, the sample reattracts low energy secondary electrons to its positively charged surface, as shown in the figure on the right. Our group employs numerous techniques in order to minimize these charging effects for insulators. We utilize enhanced low fluence methods for insulator yields that allow us to conduct measurements at low currents down to less than 1 nanoamp per square millimeter and pulse widths of less than 4 microseconds, containing just under 1,000 electrons per square millimeter. The experiment also contains an in situ surface voltage probe, along with the ability to neutralize sample charging with low energy electrons and UV radiation. Such technical capabilities allow for precision absolute yields by measuring all currents with approximately 1 to 2% accuracy for conductors and 2 to 5% accuracy for insulators. Even with such precise and accurate technical methods, we can still measure yields within a wide range of 10 eV up to 80 keV. Next, please. There have been a number of previous electron yield measurements conducted by a few research groups across the world on lunar dust. Although these were fantastic attempts made by highly experienced groups, their data was acknowledged as incomplete. This is due to the sheer number of technical difficulties of conducting such a measurement, because as shown previously, these materials are prone to charging very easily, which severely affects the data. This slide shows two plots of the same data taken of lunar dust by 3 previous research groups. It should be noted that Dukes' sample data is almost completely charged, as evidenced by yields very near the charging limit of 1 across the energy spectrum, and a total yield maximum of less than 1.1. Willis' sample has charging near the higher energy points, and gold only reported yields of 1, the first crossover energy. Therefore, the majority of the data is pretty much 1, which indicates the samples were very charged. Moreover, each of these authors explicitly have said in their papers that charging had a significant effect on their results. The reason for showing these two plots is to accentuate the differences, and for the rest of the presentation, we will show our group's data on log-log plots in order to emphasize their accuracy. Next, please. So one of the primary technical difficulties is how to even get measurements of granular and highly insulative materials, as they are subject to electrostatically loft during data collection, just like on the moon. And more importantly, how do we know the uncertainty and systemic errors in the data when there is limited complete comparison data? All these concerns may be addressed by carefully selecting the substrate to which these aluminum particulates are embedded. And our choice was some form of graphite substrate. The reason for this is that similar compounds such as HOPG graphite is a well understood material, as it is atomically flat, not easily contaminated, has low yield, and it is conductive. In fact, our lab uses HOPG graphite data as a standard for all electron yield measurements. This HOPG data has been compared to data sets of other research institutions that are also capable of these measurements in order to verify that we are all in agreement, namely the University of Madrid, the French Aerospace Lab on NERA, and Lausanne Lab in Japan. After a great deal of experimentation with mounting these particulates to numerous forms of graphite substrates, we found the best option was a standard scanning electron microscopy double-sided graphite tape, as the conductive adhesive layer was the most optimal for fixing these particulates. Before we conducted measurements, however, on the alumina, we wanted to confirm that the adhesive layers had negligible effects on the full coverage yield data. And we did this by comparing the graphite tape data with the HOPG and found that the two fits were quite similar. And any differences were attributed to the surface roughness produced by the disordered graphite in the tape and contamination produced from the conductive adhesives. Next. So that addressed the adhesion issue. And again, this also subsequently addresses the do we have accurate data question. For our sample prep, we applied various uniform coverages of these alumina particulates onto the graphite tape via the ionized water deposition. Any additional layers above the base single layer were removed via compressed dry nitrogen. The reason for this was that if we started with a material whose electron yield was very well known and nominally increased coverages of alumina, we could then extract consistent trends so that when we measure approximately 100% coverage, we would know that the data we have on the dust is accurate. The red circles depicted on the SEM images indicate the subregions that we fed into our image analysis software to verify the coverages. This is because the incident electron beam's diameter is smaller than the sample and will hit it somewhere within this region if everything within the instrumentation is properly aligned. On the right is an example of a histogram taken from the analyzer's post-analysis user interface for the 44% coverage image. The average grain size of these particulates is approximately 68 microns, whose sizes were characterized using a laser diffractometer at Utah State Geology. Moreover, the reason alumina was chosen is because on average, it is the second most prominent component of the lunar regolith, and it is also readily available as a polishing compound in various forms and sizes, which makes it easily accessible as a sample. Next slide, please.
4 minutes.
Here we have a composite data sets that are most representative for the fits we have applied. We have taken a lot more data than this, but if we were to put it all on one graph, it would be overwhelming. Therefore, the main purpose of this slide is to show that we measured total yield and backscattered yield and calculate the difference to get the secondary yield. On the right is a graph that shows the electron emission spectra based on energy. The secondary yield occurs below 50 eV. The backscatter electron yield occurs above the engineering definition of 50 eV and is comprised of the elastic and quasi-elastic peaks. This is why our fits for the BSCY data, like the curve shown on the left graph, always goes to 0 at 50 eV. This single BSCY curve is representative of the BSCY peak on the all-electron emissions spectra figure. Next, please. The secondary electron yield curves have peaks around the same energies as TY curves and exhibit the familiar inverted V shape. We can see very distinct trends in the data as the graphite tape becomes more and more covered by the alumina dust. Note the yield peak energies and energy crossovers increase linearly with coverage. Sorry, I was my bad on that. When we apply empirical three-parameter fits to the BSCY data, the measurement sets become more distinguishable. For reference, the three parameters are the asymptotically high energy limit of the yield and energy maximum of the BSCY, and BSCY data in general is not surface sensitive as SCY data, therefore surface features should not affect it. And as shown here, the differences are minuscule regardless of coverage. Next slide, please. So this description is what this was for. The secondary electron yield curves have peaks around the same energies as the TEY curves and exhibit the familiar inverted V shape. We can see very distinct trends in the data as the graphite tape becomes more and more covered by the alumina dust. Note the yield peaks, energies, and energy crossovers increase linearly with coverage. The maximum yield decreases parabolically between the peak of the graphite tape at 0 coverage and the highest coverage as contributions from the constituent yields curves overlap. Next slide, please. So here we would like to extrapolate some additional knowledge thanks to previous measurements that we have conducted on various bulk sapphire samples. The overall shape of the curve and energy maximums are self-consistent. The primary differences are that the maximum yield depends on the nature of the sample. This shows how surface roughness can affect overall yield, as the highest yields are for solid polished alumina, the next is the unpolished, and lastly is the alumina single layer, which is also the roughest surface. However, the backscatter curves are all pretty much the same for each type. This clearly shows that there is a greater suppression of secondary electron emission in the particulate alumina due to surface roughness and microcavities between particulates, which further supports current theories and models of regolith charging. It is also an important test case for simple quantitative models of the effects of layers, contamination, composites, and roughness currently being developed by our group. Next, please. So here's our data compared with real lunar dust. I wish to clarify this is not implying that our data is better, because lunar dust is just way much more complex in terms of grain sizing, angularity, porosity, and various compounds mixed together. Rather, we wish to show that we are capable of taking difficult measurements on these highly insulated particulate compounds in the first place. So taking these comparisons with a grain of salt, we can see here that the first crossover energy for approximately 100% coverage alumina dust sample does agree with the range of the first crossover energies of the lunar dust data. However, the second crossovers, sigma max and E max, do not agree. We suggest the disagreements all result from charging effects in previous studies, again, as indicated by the blue boxes on the graph. Recall our data is only for a single layer, so if we conduct measurements of multi-layer samples, the secondary electron suppression effect may be even more severe and therefore may agree with Willis's delta max, whose overall data is more depressed. Next, please.
1 minute.
Our data of this single layer is only beginning of a more in-depth study, and we continue to develop our instrumentation to provide the most accurate yield measurements possible. As for the immediate future and utilizing the same methodology for this initial data set, we ambitiously propose on conducting measurements on different size spherical alumina dust. One of the sizes similar to the size in this data set, in order to understand how grain size and angularity affect charging. Later on, we will also conduct measurements on various size single layer samples whose distributions are similar to the size distributions of samples taken from different Apollo missions. Next, please. So a few key things to note are that yield measurements are critical for accurate models of charged lunar dust. and are drivers for many engineering requirements for projects involving lunar activities. There is still a knowledge gap in this fundamental field of lunar science due to the sheer technical difficulties involved, and that must be addressed prior to returning to the moon if we wish to maintain a prolonged presence. However, we have demonstrated here that MPG does have the ability to acquire accurate and precise field data for angular, highly insulative granular samples, and that additional measurements to include more variables are planned for silica, alumina, regolith simulants, and hopefully real lunar samples. That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on. We're